A morgue worker made the most terrifying and unbelievable discovery of his life when he heard sounds coming from inside a coffin. This was no ordinary funeral, because there was someone still breathing inside that coffin. Stay with us until the end to understand this incredible, touching story. The sun was directly overhead in Houston. The air was still. San Fausto's small cemetery, with its dried-up trees and iron gate that creaked when someone passed by, seemed frozen in time, as if asleep. Robert Hayes wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He had been doing this for 20 years. For 20 years, he had been receiving and opening coffins and closing metal drawers, placing bodies in coffins, preparing burials, listening to cries and screams, but also to heavy silences that hurt more than tears. It was a job that no longer surprised him, or at least it shouldn't have surprised him. That afternoon, they handed him a simple light wood coffin. There was a piece of paper stuck to the lid. He leaned in to read it. Ana Olvera, 28 years old, sudden death, Robert muttered to himself, almost as if the hot air that suffocated him had stopped for a moment. Whenever he received someone so young, he felt a tightness in his chest. Outside, the wind was barely blowing. The smell of wilted flowers mingled with that of dry earth. Robert took a deep breath, feeling the weight of routine and, at the same time, a strange discomfort. He didn't know what it was, but that silence felt different. He straightened up, ran his hand over his unshaven beard, and said in a low voice, almost with respect, "Welcome, Miss Anna. I'm going to take care of you now." Robert always talked to the dead. It was his way of showing respect, of reminding himself that there were not only bodies there, but stories, families, dreams that had been interrupted. Robert looked again at the coffin in front of him. The wood still shone, as if it had been hastily waxed, but it had sturdy nails firmly sealed. It seemed strange to him. It was unusual to receive a coffin that was already closed and ready, without going through the routine of the local amphitheater, without changing the clothes. Normally, each body arrived wrapped in sheets and had to be cleaned, dressed, and prepared. Here, everything was already done, as if they wanted to get rid of that part quickly. They only skipped all that in cases of viral disease and with a prohibition on opening it, which was not the case. He approached slowly, running his hand over the smooth lid. The heat made his palm slip. He sighed deeply, then quickly muttered to himself, frowning. He grabbed the clipboard to check the papers again. Nothing but the name, age, and cause of death. Sudden death, that was all. No clinical details, no known city seal. He lightly touched the side of the coffin with his fingertips, only to hear the hollow sound of the wood. That bothered him. He went to the door and called one of the assistants, a young man in his 20s who was carrying flowers to the chapel. "Henry, come here a minute." The young man wiped the sweat from his brow with his sleeve and approached. "What's up, Don Robert?" Robert pointed to the coffin. "Strange, don't you think? It came already sealed. It didn't go through us." Henry shrugged his shoulders. It must be something the family wants to avoid delays. I don't know." Robert scratched his head, unconvinced. But who's in a hurry to bury a 28-year-old girl?" The boy didn't answer. He smiled a little nervously, as if he didn't want to get involved, and went back to his work. Robert was left alone again with that silence. He walked around the coffin, observing every detail. The nails were well placed, and there was a slight smell of formaldehyde coming from the cracks. It was as if they had sealed not only the wood, but also any explanation. The room felt even hotter. The noise of the fan in the corner did not help at all. Robert rested both hands on the lid and stood motionless for a few seconds, looking down. "Why such a hurry, young lady?" he whispered, almost as if talking to the person inside. But as always, no one answered. Only the distant echo of his own voice mixed with the rustling of the trees outside. Robert was arranging the wreaths in the small cemetery chapel. It wouldn't be long before the family and visitors arrived. The lit candles made the air feel even hotter, mixed with the sweet scent of the already wilted roses. He walked slowly, shuffling his feet across the worn tile floor. The coffin in the center seemed to stare at him in silence. Suddenly, a sharp sound. 3 short taps coming from there. Tap, tap, tap. Robert froze. The flower arrangement slipped from his hands, scattering petals all over the floor. His eyes widened, and his heart raced for a few seconds. He couldn't even breathe. "No, it can't be," he muttered, clutching his chest with his hands. He looked around. The chapel was empty. Only the crickets could be heard in the distance outside. He swallowed. He took a step back. It was just my imagination, he thought. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the wood creaking. But the cold sweat on the back of his neck wouldn't let him believe that. He turned toward the coffin fearfully, each step sounding loud in the silence. He touched the side with his fingertips. Nothing, just silence. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and tried to laugh at himself. 20 years in this job, and I'm still scared of the shadows or whatever. He turned around to fix the fallen flowers. It was at that moment that he heard it again, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. Robert dropped the vase he was holding. The sound echoed in the chapel. His hands were shaking. The blood drained from his face. He didn't think twice. He went straight to the coffin and pressed his ear against the lid, his heart beating at the same rhythm as the tapping he had heard. And then came the sound that almost made his legs give way. A muffled, weak, choked voice. "Help!" Robert jumped back, tripping over his own foot. "My God," he muttered, breathing heavily. He looked toward the door as if he wanted to run out, but his eyes returned to the sealed wood. Sweat ran down his face, soaking his already wet shirt. That voice couldn't have been his imagination. It couldn't have been, and in that moment, alone in the face of the impossible, Robert felt the world spinning. The coffin held not only silence, but someone calling for help. Robert felt his legs go weak. He left the flower arrangement on the bench, almost knocking over the candles. He put his hand to his chest and took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in his fingers. Calm down, Robert whispered to himself, as if trying to calm a frightened horse. He ran toward the chapel door and shouted in a broken voice, "Father, Father, please." And then louder, "Family, someone from the family, please come." The priest was the first to appear in his simple cassock, sweating like everyone else on that endless afternoon. "What happened, son?" Robert swallowed hard. 3 knocks from here," he said, pointing to the coffin with a trembling hand and a voice he swore he had heard. The priest looked at the coffin, then at Robert, and sighed slowly, putting his hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes wood creaks. The heat does that, and our hearts play tricks on us when we're tired." 2 women and a man entered, relatives with red eyes and faces wrinkled from crying so much. One of them wiped her tears with a handkerchief and asked suspiciously, "What happened?" Robert took another deep breath, feeling the sweat running down the back of his neck. "I know it's going to sound strange, but I heard banging in here and someone calling for help. I heard it." The woman bit her lip and fiddled with her rosary between her fingers. The man stepped forward, not aggressively, but firmly. "Mr. Robert, please respect our grief," he said, his voice breaking. He coughed. "She's gone." Another older voice spoke softly, almost like a sigh. "You're nervous, sir. You work at this every day. Sometimes your mind deceives us." Robert squeezed his eyes shut, as if that would help him remember the sound more clearly. "I'm not making it up. I swear on everything." There were 3 sharp knocks. He made the gesture with his knuckles in the air, as if repeating them. Tap, tap, tap. The father raised his hands, asking for calm. "Let's do this." His voice was firm and calm. "Let's breathe. I'm going to pray. You, Robert, have a glass of water. The heat is terrible." Robert bit his cheek, fighting the doubt. His forehead was throbbing. "I'm not crazy, Father," he whispered. "I know, son. replied the father with a tired smile. "But now calm down." The family approached the coffin carefully, touched the wood, and cried softly. The man ran his hand over the lid and closed his eyes as if giving it one last caress. No one said anything else. All that could be heard were sobs, sighs, and the distant sound of the gate squeaking outside. Robert took 2 steps back, his heart still beating strangely. His throat felt dry, and he had a taste of iron in his mouth. He took the glass of water brought to him by the assistant and wet his lips. The father began a prayer in a low voice, the words floating in the hot air. "Grant them eternal rest, Lord." Robert tried to follow along, but his thoughts were slipping away. What if it wasn't my head spinning? What if there was someone there? The image of the blows returned, and the stifled word, like someone trapped inside a closet. He closed his eyes. The face of the young woman he didn't even know appeared in his mind, pale, gasping for air. The prayer ended. The family embraced. The youngest cried harder, and the father hugged her by the shoulders. Robert felt his chest tighten with guilt. What if I'm right? What if I stay silent? And the thought was cut short by a chill that rose from his back to the nape of his neck. He looked at the coffin, looked at the father. "I'm just going to check again," he said quietly. "It'll be quick." No one answered. Maybe they thought he just wanted to calm down. Robert took slow, almost silent steps, as if afraid of waking something. The air felt heavier near the wood. The smell of formaldehyde and old flowers stuck in his nose. The candle flames flickered, as if an invisible wind were blowing. He rested his palm on the side of the coffin and held his breath as if he were diving. His own blood made a buzzing sound in his ears. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Nothing. Another 2. Nothing. And then it happened. Quick, nervous, desperate taps. Robert crouched down, reflexively, his ear pressed against the wood. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His heart wanted to come out of his mouth. "My God," he whispered, almost without a voice. The knocks repeated irregularly, like a weak fist trying to say something. He felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. His shirt stuck to his back. A taste of panic rising in him, but he held it back. He squeezed his own hand until it hurt. He couldn't scream. He couldn't lose his mind. He had to think, but his thoughts were a thin thread about to break. He took a step back, trembling, and looked around. The family was crying in their corners, unaware. The father was saying something softly, trying to comfort them. It was as if everyone else were in another room, and only he was there, on the verge of a secret that didn't fit in his chest. The blows stopped again. The silence returned, heavy, hot, sticky on the skin. Robert wiped his face with his sleeve and stood still for a few seconds, trying to hear any sign. Time stretched out, doubt gnawing at his heart. What if it was his imagination? What if the heat, the exhaustion, the years on this job had scrambled his mind? He almost believed that, almost until he remembered the rhythm, the urgency, the tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock that no one wants to hear in a place like this. Robert closed his eyes and inhaled slowly through his nose, holding the air. When he released it, he felt his hands steady a little. They were still shaking, but less so. He knew what he had heard. He knew it, and now that certainty hurt like a stone in his chest. He looked at the father, at the family gathered together, and then at the coffin, which seemed to beat silently in the middle of the chapel. His throat was dry, but what he felt burned stronger than fear. The father was already beginning to say his farewells in a firm voice, trying to bring peace to the mourners. The candles flickered, illuminating the tired faces wet with tears. The older sister of the deceased clutched a handkerchief, trembling, while her husband squeezed her hand tightly. Everyone waited for the farewell. It was at that moment that Robert could no longer hold back. His chest exploded, as if courage had knocked down a door he was trying to keep closed. He stepped forward, raised his arms, and shouted, "Stop everything! Stop now!" The echo of his voice cut through the chapel like a knife. Everyone turned around in fear. The priest remained silent in the middle of his prayer, the rosary clutched between his fingers. The relatives looked at each other, some indignant, others completely confused. Robert took a deep breath and said in a trembling but firm voice, "There's someone alive in here, inside." The silence that followed was so heavy that it seemed as if the air had been sucked out of the room. One of the women put her hand to her mouth, unable to believe it. The oldest man took 2 steps forward, furious. "What are you saying? You're crazy. She's dead." Robert raised his hand, pointing to the coffin. "I heard it. Not once, but twice. Knocks and a voice asking for help." The sister of the deceased shook her head, crying, "No, no, please, don't play with that." Robert felt his chest break with pain. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want to open wounds in those who were already bleeding from grief, but what he had heard still rang in his ears. "Alive, desperate, I swear to you, for my dead daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "I heard it. It's not my imagination." A murmur ran through the room. The father raised his hand, asking for calm, but even he seemed nervous. The candle flames flickered more strongly, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Robert took another step, now very close to the coffin. He placed his palm on the lid, took a deep breath, and looked at everyone. "If I'm wrong, may God strike me down. But if I'm right," his voice broke, but he didn't back down. "If I'm right, then there is a life in here that is still breathing." The sister of the deceased slumped down on the bench, crying even harder, while another woman suddenly stood up, pointing her finger at Robert. "You need help. Don't play with our pain." A loud murmur, loud commotion filled the room, disorderly voices full of pain and indignation. "How barbaric! Get him out of here! He's out of his mind!" Robert raised his hands, his voice trembling, trying to speak louder than the uproar. "I'm not crazy. I heard it. Someone asked for help from inside, but no one wanted to listen. People were agitated. Some stood up, others shouted. The pain turned to anger. The heat felt stronger, as if the air had disappeared. The priest stood in the middle, opening his arms, his cassock moving with his steps. "Silence, please." His voice sounded strong with authority. "Calm down. We are in the house of God. Don't forget where we are." Some fell silent, others murmured softly, but the atmosphere remained tense, as if everyone were about to explode. The priest looked at Robert with a tired expression, almost begging him to leave. "Son, understand. The family is suffering. Perhaps your mind." And then it happened, much louder. 3 sharp, clear knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The whole room froze. The sound echoed off the wood, loud and impossible to deny. Everyone turned to the coffin. The silence that followed was more frightening than the noise itself, and before anyone could take a deep breath, the banging returned, faster and more desperate, like nails scratching, like weak fists trying to break the wood. The sister of the deceased put her hands to her mouth and let out a muffled cry. "Oh my God!" The man who had previously called Robert crazy took a step back, pale, unable to say a word. The women cried. Some prayed aloud, clasping their rosaries in their trembling hands. The father, who had been trying to calm everyone down, stood still, staring at the coffin with his eyes wide open. His lip trembled as if he wanted to pray, but the words would not come out. Robert, his face wet with sweat and tears, just murmured almost without a voice, looking at the relatives. They hear him now. They hear him. What was once doubt turned into collective terror. No one dared to say it was madness anymore. The impossible was there in front of everyone, and in that instant, the pain of a funeral mingled with the oldest fear, the fear of realizing that inside that box there was perhaps not only death, but a life struggling to get out. But Robert no longer heard anything. He ran back, grabbing the bar with both hands, his fingers trembling, but there was a new strength in his arms, an urgency that left no room for doubt. He placed the iron tip on the edge of the lid and pushed hard. The first crack sounded loud, nails giving way, wood groaning, his face covered in sweat, his teeth clenched, his breathing heavy. Each movement produced another sharp crack with each nail that came out. Despair grew among those who were there. Some cried, others prayed, others wanted to stop Robert, but no one dared to approach him. With one last effort, he lifted the bar. The sound of metal mingled with an unbearable smell that filled the air in the chapel, a strong smell of formaldehyde acid that made many people cover their noses and mouths. Recoiling in fear, Robert choked on the smell, but did not stop. He ripped off the lid with force, and it fell to the floor with a thud. The silence that followed was total. Everyone bowed their heads as if time had stopped, their eyes fixed on the inside of the coffin. What should have been still moved. A fragile, pale arm trembled like a leaf in the wind and slowly rose. Thin fingers scratched at the air, searching for something to grab onto. The body was breathing weakly, but it was breathing. A collective murmur filled the room. The cries turned into screams of surprise. "My God, she's alive!" Robert took half a step back, the bar still in his hands, unable to believe what he was seeing. His eyes filled with tears. His mouth opened without words. The impossible was in front of him. And if that coffin closed for death, there was life fighting to return. The body that should have been still moved first, the weak fingers scratching the air, then the chest rising and falling, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then the eyes. Two tired, heavy eyes opened with effort, pupils that seemed to fight against the darkness. Anna took a deep breath like someone coming out of water. The air entered her lungs irregularly, accompanied by a low moan that was almost impossible to hear. Her face was pale as wax, her lips blue, but there was life there. A woman screamed, covering her face with her hands. "My God!" The scream was loud, mixed with others that came after it. Cries, exclamations, rapid prayers. Some recoiled back in fear. Others knelt on the ground as if they were witnessing a miracle. Robert felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Tears flowed without him realizing it. The iron bar slipped from his hands and fell to the ground with a metallic sound. He covered his mouth with both hands, his eyes fixed on the young woman who was now trying to move her head. "She's alive," he murmured, unable to believe it. What he was saying. Anna opened her eyes completely, blinking slowly as if the light hurt her. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse sigh came out of her throat. The father approached, trembling, and grabbed the crucifix on his chest. "Holy Lord," he whispered with a broken voice. Anna's sister fell to her knees near the coffin, crying, "Anna, sister, it's me." She reached out her hand, but hesitated to touch her, as if she were afraid of hurting her. The young woman's eyes moved slowly, recognizing her sister's face. A single tear rolled down the corner of her eye. Silence filled the room for a few seconds, broken only by her weak breathing. Everyone in the room felt the weight of that moment. It was as if death had stopped, as if life had cried out before fading away completely. Robert closed his eyes tightly and wiped his face with trembling hands, and murmured to himself, almost like a prayer, "Thank you, God, thank you." And in front of everyone, Anna breathed weakly, broken but alive against all odds, against everyone, against the impossible. The hospital doors opened with a bang when the stretcher was pushed in by two nurses. Anna's body was covered up to her chest, her breathing short. Her sister ran beside her, holding her hand, while her father tried to calm the relatives who continued to cry and pray behind them. Robert walked a little behind, his heart beating fast, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Quick, please," begged the sister, her voice breaking. "She's dying." The nurses gently pushed her aside, pushing the stretcher toward the emergency room. The doors closed in front of everyone, leaving the hallway silent. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall and the low sobs of the family. Robert Korsabashabert leaned against the wall, wiping the sweat from his face. He felt as if he were dreaming. How could someone be alive inside a coffin? Minutes passed that seemed like hours until a doctor came out of the room. Her face was serious, but she did not look scared. The patient is alive, very weak, but alive. Anna's sister fell to her knees on the floor, crying loudly. She was not dead. She was in a deep coma. A long sigh was heard in the hallway. Everyone hugged each other and cried. Some even laughed nervously. The father made the sign of the cross with his eyes full of tears. Robert covered his mouth with his hands, unable to believe it. Then he tried to ask a question, but no sound came out. The doctor finished, looking at everyone with a serious face. She had been declared dead by mistake, a very serious mistake. The words fell like stones. The sister sobbed, almost unable to stand. The man in the suit who had previously called Robert crazy now approached him with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, holding back his tears. "You saved her." Robert said nothing. He felt his chest tighten again, but this time it was different. It wasn't fear. It was a mixture of relief and courage. That night, in his simple home, he couldn't sleep. The scene replayed over and over again and again. The closed coffin, the banging, the voice calling for help. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the muffled sound in his ears. Sitting at the table, with a lit candle illuminating the kitchen, Robert looked at the papers he had obtained about the case. There was the death certificate with the stamp and signature. He ran his fingers over the paper, as if looking for answers hidden between the lines. How could this have happened? He muttered to himself. Who was in such a hurry to bury her? The clock read almost 3 in the morning. His eyes were heavy, but sleep would not come. Something was wrong, very wrong. He knew it. That young woman's life had been in danger because of a mistake that made no sense. And Robert, his hands trembling on the certificate, felt a certainty within himself. He had to find out who had signed that paper and why. Robert arrived early at the hospital, his eyes red from having slept almost nothing. His tired face showed the weight of the last few days. He asked to speak to the administration, and after waiting many minutes in a cold hallway, he was called into a small room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Behind the desk, an employee adjusted her glasses, surrounded by folders and stamps. Robert took a deep breath before speaking. "Ma'am, I need to see a copy of Miss Anna Olvera's death certificate." She looked at him in surprise. "Why? That's no longer valid, sir. It was verified that it was a mistake." Robert rested both hands on the desk, trying to calm down. "I know, but I need to see who signed that paper." The woman sighed, searched through some drawers, and after a few minutes placed the document in front of him. The paper was already crumpled at the edges, but the stamp was still legible. Robert looked down and slowly read each word as if it were hitting him in the chest. Death certificate. Anna Olvera, 28 years old. Cause of death, sudden death. Signed by Dr. Montalban. He frowned. "Montalban?" The employee looked at him without understanding. "Yes, that's what it says." Robert looked up, his voice breaking. "I've been working in the morgue for 20 years. I know all the doctors in this area, and I've never heard that name." The woman adjusted her clothes, again, somewhat uncomfortable, because maybe he's a visiting doctor. Sometimes they call someone from another city. Robert shook his head firmly. "No, not here. Everyone knows each other, especially in cases like this. I've never seen him or heard his name." He ran his finger slowly over the signature at the bottom of the document. The handwriting was quick, almost illegible, as if it had been done carelessly. Something inside him told him that there was a lie on that paper. The employee wanted to end the conversation. "Look, Mr. Hayes, you've done enough. You should rest." But Robert didn't move. He stored every detail of that signature in his mind. as if it were a clue placed there on purpose. "Thank you," he said in a low voice. He left the room slowly, the document still spinning in his head. In the hallway, he paused for a moment, leaning against the wall. The name wouldn't leave his mind. Montalban. Who was that doctor? And why would someone no one knew sign such and such an important death certificate? The hospital hallway was silent that afternoon. The distant sound of heart monitors and the hurried footsteps of nurses seemed to come from another world. Robert was sitting in one of the blue plastic chairs, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together. His face showed the exhaustion and anguish of someone who still did not understand everything that had happened. Suddenly, a shadow approached. It was a young woman with a distressed look on her face, her hair tied back haphazardly, her blouse wrinkled as if she had rushed out of the house. Her tearful eyes showed nights without sleep. Robert asked, his voice trembling. He slowly raised his head. Mariana took a deep breath, as if gathering courage were a struggle. "I'm Mariana, Anna's sister." The two remained silent for a moment. Robert adjusted his shirt, not knowing what to say. The woman nervously clasped her hands until the words came out. "I have to tell you something, but I'm afraid." Robert frowned. "Tell me. If it's about Anna, I want to help." Mariana looked around to make sure no one was listening. She approached him and spoke almost in a whisper. Someone wanted my sister to leave too soon." Robert felt a chill down his spine, as if she were leaving. Mariana closed her eyes for a second, tears falling. They prepared the funeral with a strange haste. They didn't want to wait. They didn't call anyone in the family to confirm anything. They just closed the coffin and took her away. She put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears. I know something strange happened." Robert took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but inside, his heart was already beating fast. And who made that decision? Who wanted to rush so much? Mariana looked down, her voice lower, almost like a whisper. "I don't know, but someone pulled the strings, someone with power." Silence fell between them. Mariana trembled, as if she were afraid of even the walls surrounding them. Robert watched her, and deep in her eyes he saw more than pain. He saw the weight of a secret that no one wanted to bear. He put his hand firmly on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. "Calm down. Tell me everything. I'm listening." Mariana took a deep breath, swallowed her tears, and nodded slowly, as if deciding to trust him. "My sister shouldn't be underground, and someone wanted it that way." The words hung in the air, cutting Robert's heart. It was confirmation of what he already feared. The rush wasn't an oversight. It was intentional, and that changed everything. Robert and Mariana were sitting in a corner of the hallway on hard plastic chairs. Between them, a cup of cold coffee that no one dared to drink. Mariana moved her fingers non-stop, biting her lip, her gaze lost, until with a long sigh, she decided to speak. "My sister Anna had problems that no one in the family knew about." Robert turned to look at her attentively. "What problems?" Mariana closed her eyes for a moment, as if even saying it were difficult. "Debts, many debts. She got involved with the wrong person." Robert frowned. "With whom?" Mariana's voice came out almost as a whisper, full of fear. "With a loan shark. Everyone here knows him. Fausto Galvan." The name fell like a weight between them. Robert remained silent, staring at the floor. Mariana continued to squeeze the rosary she was holding in her hand. "My sister was desperate. She was asking for money to pay other bills, to cover expenses she couldn't afford. And he caught her." Tears began to fall thickly. "Anna told me she couldn't take it anymore, that he was pressuring her, calling her every day. I asked her to come with me, to seek help, but she was afraid." Robert Hachuber took a deep, heavy breath. "And you think he had something to do with all this?" Mariana raised her tearful eyes and nodded slowly. "Yes, I think so. He wanted to silence her, and someone agreed to help him." Because the funeral was too quick, Mr. Robert. Too quick. She began to tremble, hiding her face in her hands. Who signs a death certificate without checking it? Who dares to lock a living person in a box? That's not a mistake. That's a crime. Robert reached out and held her hand tightly. Calm down, he said in a hoarse voice. You're not alone in this. Mariana cried uncontrollably. I don't know who to trust here. Everyone is afraid of Fausto. Everyone. And now I'm afraid if what they did to my sister could happen again. Silence returned, interrupted only by the beeping of a machine in the next room. Robert stared into space, his jaw clenched. Inside him, a mixture of rage and helplessness grew. Someone had wanted to bury Anna before her time, and Mariana believed that the debt to that soulless man was the key to understanding why. But the question that burned inside her still had no answer. Who agreed to help hasten her death? That morning, Robert walked home as he had done for 20 years. The sky was cloudy and heavy, and the air was even warmer than usual. He pushed the iron gate when something caught his attention, a folded piece of paper taped to the front door. He frowned, tore off the paper, and opened it slowly. The writing was harsh, hurriedly written to scare him. Be careful what you hear. Silence saves lives. Robert read it 3 times. His hands began to sweat, and he glanced quickly to the sides as if someone might be watching him. The street was almost empty. Only a dog barking could be heard in the distance, but the feeling of being watched stuck to him like a shadow. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. His heart was pounding. He knew what it meant. He knew that getting involved in this had a price. He entered his house and slammed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the room, breathing deeply, trying to calm his chest, but the paper burned in his pocket as if it were on fire. And then, as if the warning had opened an old wound, the memory came back with force. Robert saw himself years ago, running through the corridors of a hospital, his little daughter in his arms with a very high fever, her eyes closed, her body limp. He screamed for help. Please, my daughter is dying. A nurse appeared with a clipboard in her hands. Sir, you have to pay for the consultation first. Robert almost knelt down. I don't have any money right now. Please treat her. She's my daughter. But the response was curt, without looking him in the eye. Hospital rules. Without payment, we can't admit her. He tried to plead desperately, grabbing the nurse's gown and crying, I'll pay later, but don't let her die. No one moved. Time passed, and his daughter, very weak, took her last breath in his arms. Robert's cry that night was heard throughout the hospital, but no one moved. I'll pay later, but don't let her die. No one moved. Time passed, and his daughter, very weak, took her last breath in his arms. Robert's cry that night was heard throughout the hospital, but no one consoled him. Only papers, rules, silence. Since then, his hatred for the system never left him. He kept the guilt, the pain, the feeling that the lives of ordinary people were worthless in the face of money and coldness in his heart. Now back at present, Robert wiped away the tears that were falling without him realizing it. He crumpled the paper in his pocket. Not again, he muttered, his voice firm but broken. No one else. The warning told him to keep quiet, but inside Robert, the memory of his lost daughter screamed louder than any threat. Robert was at home, sitting at the kitchen table with a lit candle illuminating the papers he was still reviewing. The crumpled piece of paper he had found at the door of the morgue was there beside him as a constant reminder of the danger. The clock read almost 2 in the morning. The silence was so great that he could hear his own heartbeat. It was in that silence that a different noise was heard. The engine of a slow-moving car approaching. He frowned and slowly got up. He went to the window. The thin curtain let in the dim light from the street outside. Parked in front of his house was a black car, the engine off, the lights on for a few seconds, and then off. Inside were 2 men. They didn't smoke, they didn't talk, they didn't move, they just stared. Robert felt a chill down his spine. He pressed the curtain with trembling fingers, trying to see better. One of the men turned his face, and even though it was dark, the cold gleam of his eyes met Robert's. His heart raced. He quickly backed away, slamming the curtain shut. His breathing became short and rapid. He leaned against the wall with his hands on his knees, trying to control the fear that was growing. "My God," he whispered softly. The silence of the street now seemed more dangerous. The car wasn't leaving. It remained there, standing still like a shadow, waiting for its prey to move. Robert went to the living room, turned off the lights, closed the other curtains, ran his hand over his forehead, which was covered in cold sweat, and looked around the small, fragile house, facing something he didn't even understand himself. He took 2 steps to the door and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Only the distant sound of a dog barking in another neighborhood. And then, once again, the engine. The car started slowly. Robert ran to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the black car begin to move, gliding into the darkness, disappearing around the corner as if it had never been there. He stood still, staring at the empty street, his heart still pounding in his chest. Then he closed the curtain, stepped back, and fell into the armchair. He ran his hands over his face, breathing deeply, trying to convince himself that he was still safe. But he knew deep down that this was no ordinary visit. It was a warning, and this time it wasn't written on paper. It was in the cold eyes of those 2 men who, without saying a word, had made it clear that they were watching him. The hospital room was almost dark, the curtains closed, letting in only a sliver of morning light. The beeping of the machines was the only sign that life was still fighting inside. Robert sat in an iron chair, his body leaning forward, his hands clasped as if he were praying silently. The sleepless days were already evident in his deep, dark circles, but he didn't move from there. Suddenly, a gentle movement. Anna's breathing became stronger, like a breath trying to return to the world. Her eyes trembled before opening slowly, heavy as lead. Robert jumped up, but didn't speak loudly. He approached slowly, almost not believing it. "Anna, can you hear me?" She blinked. Her dry lips moved with difficulty. She had no strength, but she was conscious. Robert took her hand gently, as if afraid of breaking it. Calm down. You're safe." Her eyes filled with silent tears. She opened her mouth, and a hoarse whisper came out, almost without sound. "I heard everything." Robert brought his face close, his forehead almost touching hers, to hear better. "What did you hear?" She was breathing short and painfully, but she didn't stop. "Inside the box, I heard voices, footsteps, prayers." She swallowed, tears running down her temples. "I thought no one would hear me, but you saved me." Robert closed his eyes, feeling a lump in his throat. "It was God. No, I just heard it." Anna squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. Her gaze, though weak, had a frightening certainty. "I know who did this to me." Robert opened his eyes, his heart beating very fast. "Who?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering the energy to say it was very difficult. Her lips trembled before uttering the name that seemed to weigh a ton. Fausto Galvan. The name sounded like poison in the air. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He let go of her hand for a moment, taking a step back, as if he had been hit. He felt nauseous. He had heard that name before. Everyone in town had heard it. Fausto Galvan was not just a loan shark. He was a feared man, the owner of forced silences and debts that ended in tragedy. Robert took her hand again, trying to speak firmly, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with fear. "Are you sure? I won't let anything else happen to you." Anna closed her eyes slowly, as if those words were the only thing keeping her there. But the weight of the name did not leave the room. It remained in the air, making Robert's heart beat faster, because now there was no doubt. The impossible was not a coincidence. It had a name, a face, and it was the most feared man in town, Fausto Galvan. Robert entered the police station with firm steps, but his heart was beating like a drum. The room smelled of old cigarettes and stored papers. The deputy, a pot-bellied man with a tired face, was behind a desk piled high with folders. He looked up only when Robert threw the hospital report on the table. "Chief, what happened to Ana Olvera was not a mistake," Robert said tensely. "She named Fausto Galvan." The chief raised an eyebrow in disbelief. The chief leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Mr. Hayes, do you have any idea what you're saying?" Robert approached, slamming his hand on the table. "I have an idea. The girl was alive in a coffin. I heard her. I took her out, and she told me who was behind it." The delegate sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. "Look, I don't doubt your good intentions. You did the right thing, but words are not proof." Robert's eyes widened. "They're not proof? And the death certificate signed by a phantom doctor?" The delegate pulled out the folder, opened the document, and calmly read the signature. "Dr. Montalban," he muttered. "We have no record of him." "Exactly," shouted Robert. "That man doesn't exist here. They made him up to cover everything up." The delegate slammed the folder shut and pushed it aside, as if wanting to end the conversation. "And what do you want me to do? Arrest Galvan just because you say so?" Robert took a step back, unable to believe it. "I'm not saying it, she is." The delegate looked at him seriously, in a low voice, almost like a father scolding his child. "And without material evidence, your testimony is not enough. You know how the justice system—" Robert felt his blood boil. He clenched his fists until they hurt. "Then we'll wait until they bury her again before we act." The deputy looked away and remained silent for a few seconds, then lit a cigarette and took a long drag. "I understand your anger, but my hands are tied." Robert took a deep breath, trying not to explode. The room seemed to get smaller, the air heavier. Finally, he muttered in a broken voice, "They always say the same thing. Our hands are tied, but the ones who end up tied are the innocent ones." He turned around, opened the door forcefully, and left, leaving the deputy standing still behind the cloud of smoke in the hallway. Robert paused for a moment, running his hand over his face. The frustration hurt more than the fear, and when he tried to find strength in the only clue he had, he realized something even uglier. This Dr. Montalban had disappeared, as if he had never existed. There was no record, no trace, nothing. Mariana arrived at the hospital with a sad face, as if she were carrying more weight than her body could bear. There was something different in her eyes from the last time she spoke to Robert. It wasn't just sadness, it was determination. She entered the room where he was waiting for her, sitting near Anna's bed, and motioned for him to follow her into the hallway. Robert got up slowly, feeling the tension in the air. Outside, away from prying eyes, Mariana opened the bag with trembling hands and took out an old cell phone with a broken screen, covered in tape to keep the cover from falling off. She looked him in the eyes before handing it to him. "This phone belonged to Anna. I found it hidden among her things." Robert took the device carefully, as if it were something very valuable. "What's in here?" Mariana took a deep breath, her voice breaking. Messages. Messages she didn't want anyone to see. With effort, they turned on the cell phone. The screen lit up Robert's face as he began to read the saved conversations. His heart beat fast with every word that came out. "Would you rather die asleep or awake?" Robert read it aloud, his voice trembling. "Holy God." The messages continued. "Silence is also a choice. You know what happens if you don't pay." Mariana covered her face with her hands, crying softly. She was afraid. "Robert, but she didn't tell me everything. She just left this hidden." Robert clutched the cell phone tightly, his hands sweaty. Every word he read confirmed what he already felt in his heart. It wasn't a medical error. It wasn't an oversight. It was a threat. It was a crime. He looked up at Mariana. This is the proof. She nodded, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. Yes, but it's also a risk. If Galvan finds out about this phone, he'll come after us all. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what they had just discovered. Then he opened them more firmly, as if he had just made a silent promise. It doesn't matter. The truth can't stay buried, like they almost buried your sister. Mariana sobbed, leaning against the wall. I'm scared, Robert, but we can't keep quiet anymore. He grabbed the cell phone with both hands, his heart beating fast, and murmured as if talking to himself. This device can be the voice that Anna didn't have the strength to shout in the cold hospital hallway. Through tears and silence, they both understood that this cell phone was more than a forgotten object. It was the hidden evidence that could change everything. Robert spent days with Anna's cell phone in his hands, as if he were carrying a bomb about to explode. He knew that those messages could make the difference between silence and justice, but he also knew how dangerous it was to make them public. The threats were clear. The fear was real. It was Mariana who, with a trembling but firm voice, said one night, "If we keep it, nothing will change, but if we show it, maybe we can save not only Anna, but others." Robert looked at her silently for a few seconds, and then nodded. Deep down, he felt that this decision was no longer theirs alone. It was an obligation. The next day they went to the offices of a small local newspaper, known for not remaining silent in the face of the powerful. The reporter, a middle-aged man, listened to the story in silence, his eyes widening with each detail. When Robert handed him the cell phone and showed him the messages, he shook his head in surprise. "This is very serious," he muttered, grabbing the phone as if it were dynamite. "If we publish this, there will be no turning back." Robert replied immediately in a hoarse but confident voice. "There's no turning back now that they tried to bury her alive." 2 days later, the news was in all the newspapers and on all the television channels. The headline screamed in huge letters, "Young woman buried alive due to medical error or planned crime. Messages reveal threats from well-known local loan shark." Images of the family crying in the chapel where it all began, and in the hospital where Anna was fighting for her life, were constantly being broadcast. The whole city was talking about the case. People who had previously been afraid began to speak out. Witnesses appeared, and similar stories began to emerge. Robert watched everything from the small living room of his house, the TV lighting up his tired face. He watched the presenters arguing, the reporters showing the old cell phone that was now evidence, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was not alone. The pressure was so great that the police could no longer hide behind lack of evidence. The police chief appeared in front of the cameras, sweating under the lights, and announced in a serious voice, "We have opened a formal investigation. No one is above the law." Mariana cried when she heard that. Robert closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was still fear, there was still danger, but the net was beginning to close in. And now it was not just Robert's or Mariana's voice. It was the voice of an entire city that was finally rising up against the silence. The room was filled with flowers that neighbors and strangers had left as a sign of hope. The sweet smell mingled with the hospital air, and the soft afternoon light streamed in through the open curtains. Anna, still very weak, leaned on her pillows, her eyes tired but alive, her pale skin beginning to take on a little color. Mariana entered slowly, as if stepping into a sacred place. Her hands trembled, her heart beat very fast. For a moment, she stood in front of the bed, just looking at her sister. It seemed unable to believe that this moment was real. Anna saw her, and her eyes filled with tears. With difficulty, she extended her trembling hand. Mariana couldn't bear it. She ran to the bed and leaned over, hugging Anna with all the strength her body allowed. The two embraced as if the world could fall apart. Tears fell freely, mixing in a cry that was both pain and relief at the same time. Anna, between sobs, murmured between short breaths, I thought I would never see you again, that I would go alone into the dark." Mariana tightened her embrace, her voice breaking. "Don't say that. You're here. You're with me. God brought you back." Anna cried uncontrollably, clinging to her sister as if that would keep her alive. I listened to your prayers, your footsteps, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I thought I would never, ever hear your voice." The whole hospital seemed to have stopped to watch the scene. Nurses discreetly wiped their eyes. Doctors passing by in the hallway slowed down. Some patients smiled from afar, moved. There were no words to explain what was happening. It was like witnessing a miracle. Robert stood at the door, watching in silence. His chest felt tight, but this time it wasn't from fear or anger. It was from gratitude. He lowered his head and took a deep breath and let a tear escape. Mariana moved away a little to look into her sister's eyes. "I'll never let you go again, I promise." Anna smiled weakly but sincerely, still crying, "And I won't let fear silence me again." The two hugged each other again, and the room was filled with such intense emotion that it seemed to permeate the walls for a few minutes. There were no doctors, no police, no danger. There were only two sisters whom death had tried to separate, but life had brought back together. And everyone there, seeing that embrace, felt that they were witnessing something greater than any explanation could convey, the fragile but real victory of life over darkness. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of the monitor marking the rhythm of life that still wanted to stay. Anna, still weak, rested propped up on high pillows. Her pale face now had a different glow, as if her soul had returned to her eyes. Next to the bed, Mariana adjusted the blanket, but Anna seemed to be looking for someone else. Robert stood near the door, trying not to disturb, almost invisible. He had that way of being, as if he didn't want to get in the way. The years in the morgue had taught him to be a shadow, to be present without drawing attention. Anna found him with her gaze. A small but heartfelt smile appeared on her lips. She raised her hand with effort. "Robert, come here, please." He approached slowly, hesitantly. Mariana made room, wiping her tear-filled eyes. Robert pulled up a chair and sat down next to the bed, with his head bowed, as if he didn't know if he deserved to be there. Anna held out her two fragile, trembling hands. He hesitated for a second, but then took them. He felt the cold skin, the delicacy of her fingers, life beating again there. She looked him straight in the eye, and her voice, though weak, was firm, full of feeling, and trembling. He hesitated for a second, but then took them. He felt her cold skin, the delicacy of her fingers, life beating again there. She looked him straight in the eye, and her voice, though weak, came out firm and full of emotion. "You gave me back my life." Robert swallowed hard, trying to smile. "Don't say that. I just listened to what others didn't want to hear." Anna shook her head, tears falling. "No, you pulled me out of the darkness when I thought it was all over. Your voice was the only one that reached me." Her hand squeezed his, though without strength. "I will never, ever be able to repay you." Robert felt a lump in his throat. Memories of his daughter came flooding back, that little face he had never been able to save. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting a tear escape. When he spoke, his voice broke. "You don't have to pay me anything, Anna. You've already given me something I thought I would never feel again." She frowned, confused. "What thing?" He looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "The feeling that I can still save someone." Anna cried harder, pressing her hand against his chest, as if she wanted to keep those words in her heart. Mariana also cried silently, watching that impossible encounter in that room. 3 lives came together, in a moment that could not be put into words. It was not just gratitude. It was not a debt. It was something. The certainty that even in the face of death, there are gestures that can give meaning to life. The streets of Houston looked different that day. The newspapers, radio stations, and television news programs were all talking about one thing: the scandal that no one could hide anymore. The name Fausto Galvan, which until then had only been whispered, was now in big letters, along with the threatening messages that had been made public. Robert walked slowly through the market when he heard people murmuring, "He's been caught. They say the police finally arrested him. Fausto Galvan. Someone finally stood up to him." His heart began to beat faster. He could hardly believe it. On a television at a stall, the image was clear. Fausto Galvan in a dark suit, handcuffed, being led away by 2 police officers. His face showed no fear, only pent-up rage. People outside the police station were shouting, some applauding, others crying. A woman with a candle in her hand said loudly, "That man took everything from me. Today I feel that God heard me." Robert stood still, staring at the screen, unable to move his feet. The news spread quickly. Along with Galvan, 2 of his trusted men were arrested, accused of extortion and attempted murder. And the most unexpected thing was yet to come. The doctor who had signed the false death certificate trying to cross the border out of state. He was carrying cash and false documents. At the press conference, the police chief, who had been under pressure for weeks, announced that the doctor known as Montalban did not have a valid license. His identity was false, and he was now in custody. The cameras recorded every word. People celebrated in the streets, honking their horns, as if the city had been waiting years for this moment. Robert returned to the hospital that afternoon. When he entered the room, he found Mariana with the TV remote in her hand, tears streaming down her face. Anna, still weak in bed, was watching the same scene. Fausto Galvan being pushed into a police car. She looked up at Robert and whispered with a trembling voice, "He fell." Robert approached slowly, took her hand, and nodded. "He fell, and this time he won't be able to get up so easily." Mariana hugged her sister, crying on her shoulder. The whole hospital seemed to breathe differently, as if the hallways were filled with a new, lighter air. Robert said nothing, but inside he felt a mixture of relief and pain. It was not a complete victory, because nothing would erase what Anna had suffered, but for the first time in a long time, justice was not hiding behind fear. The guilty were falling, and the whole city watched in disbelief as the weight of silence was finally broken in the hospital waiting room. The TV was on, showing the evening news. Patients, nurses, and visitors were gathered in silence, their eyes glued to the screen. The reporter spoke in a serious voice, each word weighing like a stone on the hearts of those who listened. In the last few hours, the police had confirmed the discovery of 2 new cases similar to that of Ana Olvera. People declared dead, when in fact they were still alive. A murmur passed through the room. Some crossed themselves. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The camera showed images of an open emergency coffin in another city, with nail marks on the inside of the lid. A mother cried, hugging the body of her daughter, crossed themselves. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The camera showed images of an emergency open coffin in another city, with nail marks on the inside of the lid. A mother cried as she hugged the body of her daughter, who had not survived. Then another case. A 24-year-old man, buried as a homeless person, taken out of the grave, still breathing, narrowly saved. Robert's stomach churned, and his hands trembled on his knees. Mariana next to her put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide open. God, it wasn't just Anna. The reporter continued talking without softening anything. Authorities are investigating the possibility of a criminal network that used false death certificates to cover up debts, threats, and other crimes. Anna, still lying in her bed, was also watching. Her face turned pale, and silent tears ran down her temples. She squeezed her sister's hand with what little strength she had. "How many more?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Mariana hugged her, crying with her. "I don't know, but it shouldn't have happened to you or anyone else." Robert got up, unable to remain seated. He walked to the hallway window and rested his forehead against the cold glass. His reflection showed his eyes filled with tears. He murmured to himself, almost like a sigh that only he could hear, "I made it in time, but others weren't so lucky." The images on TV showed desperate families demanding justice, holding crumpled photos of their dead loved ones who were still alive. The whole country was beginning to realize that Anna's case was not an isolated miracle. It was part of something much bigger and much crueler. In that hospital, everyone remained silent. The news weighed heavily, as if the air had become thicker. It could no longer be denied. This was not an accident. It was not a coincidence. It was a wound in the city, and every word on the news made it hurt more. The sun was beginning to set when Robert walked through the San Fausto cemetery, the same one where he had heard those impossible knocks days before. His steps were slow and heavy, but there was something different in his body. It wasn't just pain. There was also a kind of silent force pushing him forward. In his hand, he carried a bouquet of simple flowers, white daisies mixed with some roses he had bought on the way. The flowers trembled in the gentle afternoon breeze. He stood in front of a small tombstone, almost hidden among larger ones. The name engraved on the stone made his chest ache again, as if it were the first time he had read it. Isabel Hayes, 7 years old. Robert knelt down slowly and ran his hand over the cold stone, wiping away the dust that had gathered on it. His face contorted, and tears came before he could say a single word. "Hello, my girl." His voice came out low and broken. It had been so long since he had been there. He placed the flowers in front of the gravestone and took a deep breath. "Forgive me," he said, closing his eyes tightly. "Forgive me for not saving you. I ran, I shouted, I begged, and they didn't listen to me. You left in my arms, and I never forgave myself." The wind blew harder, moving the petals. Robert ran his hand over his wet face, trying to hold back the tears, but he couldn't. Today was different. Today I heard another voice, a girl who was also trapped, just as you were trapped that day, between life and death. And this time I was able to save her. He rested his forehead on the gravestone, his shoulders shaking. "Today, my daughter, I saved someone, just as I couldn't save you." The silence of the cemetery seemed to embrace those words. The weight he had been carrying for years did not disappear, but a part of it remained there among the tears and fresh flowers. Robert slowly got up, dried his eyes, and looked at the sky, which was beginning to turn orange. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his daughter was not looking at him with anger, but with love, and somehow that brought a little peace to his heart, which he thought would never heal. Months passed. The hospital, the tears, the smell of formaldehyde and fear seemed distant, almost like a nightmare that was slowly turning into a memory. Anna, who before could barely move her fingers, now took firm steps, still with the help of her therapies, but with her head held high and her eyes full of life. In the auditorium of a simple school, the chairs were occupied by curious teenagers. Some laughed quietly, others played with their notebooks. The teachers asked for silence, but Anna didn't mind. She smiled, took a deep breath, and with the help of an old microphone, began to speak. "When I was about to die, I thought it was all over." Her voice trembled, but not from fear. She was truly alive, but locked away, and no one could hear her. She screamed until her voice faded away. The auditorium fell silent. Even those who had been laughing looked down. Anna walked slowly across the stage, each step marked by invisible actors, actresses that couldn't be seen. "And if I'm here today, It's because someone dared to believe in what others said was crazy. Because someone listened to what no one else wanted to hear. She paused, carefully wiping away a tear that wouldn't stop. That's why, guys, never let them silence your voices. Never think that speaking up is useless. Your voice can be the difference between life and death, between injustice and truth. A girl in the front row raised her hand timidly and asked, "Aren't you afraid to tell all that?" Anna smiled, approached her, and looked her in the eyes. "Of course I'm afraid, but fear can't be stronger than the truth." The auditorium filled with applause, some with tears, others timid, but all sincere. The teachers stood up applauding with eyes full of emotion. At the back of the room, Robert watched. He didn't go up on stage. He didn't want to draw attention. He just smiled, watching Anna turn her pain into strength, her wounds into seeds for others. She raised the microphone once more, her voice full of strength. "Never let them silence your voices, because even the smallest whisper can save a life." And in that moment, the young people understood that they were not just listening to a talk. What they were seeing was the victory of someone who, against all odds, had returned to life and was now teaching others not to remain in the face of silence. The silence of the chapel still echoes in Robert's memory. The blows, the muffled cry, the moment when Robert decided to believe in the impossible. So if you were in Robert's shoes, would you have had the courage to stop the entire ceremony? I want to read your thoughts in the comments, because this story isn't just about them, it's about all of us. And before you go, make sure to turn on the bell next to the subscribe button, because that's the only way you'll get notified as soon as new exciting stories are published. Stories of faith, courage, and pain help us see life differently. A very exciting video appears on the screen that makes many people cry and encourages them to think about the value of life. Click now, and I'll tell you this story.